And my responsibility at Ericsson is I'm the head of radio access networks and OSS solutions at element management level for North America.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. My name is Stefan Schneider. I work for SevOne. We are an infrastructure performance management solution. I run product marketing for service providers.
Very cool. So as we kind of look at the market, what kind of real-world benefits of SON are your customers seeing? I know, Stefan, you've got a bunch of stuff live in Asia that you can probably talk to. Why don't you kind of kick it off on what your customers are seeing from SON as far as benefits?
Well, first of all, we have seen nice presentations, so talking about the implementation aspects. So what we would like to contribute here is to see what we can do on the management and optimization side of these systems, especially in regards with the HETnet structure. So what we see as one challenge in the networks, as one of the first presenter told, although HETnet is inside, but it's not a part of the macro network, right? So the main challenge there is to maintain the link between the macro network and small cell network in relation with the changes that are applied dynamically on the macro layer. So although some initial configurations are handled by SON functions, both on the small cell domain and the macro cell domain, but to maintain the changes that are applied on the macro level and reflected to the other parts of the network is still a headache for the operators. So that's why we worked on this area, and we have been also participating on SA5, 3GPP SA5 for the last 4 years, trying to influence the way these standards are being shaped, maybe the only third party in this sense. So what we achieved, for instance, by allocating some radio configurations on both on the macro and the HETnet layer, and the small cell layer in an intelligent way, for instance, these PCI allocations on the centralized level, we have seen up to 30% improvements on the downlink throughput in some cases. And when we talk about also some other parameter, for instance, in RSI, for the write-related sequence, and so by optimizing that also, I mean, it also has effects on delays, and which is important for VoLTE especially, because it's like a CS-oriented service. So any contribution we put to the network is actually an add-on for the operator.
So from your perspective, Andrea, what do you see, especially in the element management world, as far as how these things play together, and maybe how they also play together with third-party systems and stuff?
Yeah, so when I think of SON, I think of hybrid SON, first of all. So I think distributed and centralized, because we believe each has its role and benefit. And as the audience knows, when LTE was first introduced, it was distributed SON that everybody was looking forward to, and the vendors were really proud of. And it was for basic functions, as you could call them today, like automatic neighbor relations. And what we've seen in that is that vendors were not always harmonized in their implementations. So in some cases, and the networks are multi-vendor. There's no more single vendor network, right? So in some cases, those functions at distributed level were working well. In other cases, were not. So operators started looking very quickly at centralizing some of these functions. And we talked about, does it make sense to centralize ANR? Does it make sense to make it an OSS function above all the element managers? And we heard oftentimes is, well, it's not whether it makes sense or not, it's about harmonizing, right? Because we can't harmonize this. Right. So, obviously we embraced centralized SON, and what we see as the main application that's been thriving is the optimization of networks, like he talked about.
So, Stefan, in what you're doing with SevOne, you're not really an OEM, but you're kind of part of the overall machine on top of it.
Absolutely. So, the first thing that we have to think about is, what's the reasons for going for SON and CRAN, right? Most people do it because they want to optimize spectrum allocation, they want to optimize their infrastructure footprint, or they want to improve customer experience, right? Having a multi-vendor network, right, and having different approaches to how you, build this, your network makes it really hard to get that visibility across, how different vendors are doing different things, right? So it drives you in the traditional sense to go and try to centralize the solution, like, Andrew say, have the control in a centralized manner that actually speaks to each vendor and, gets the best out of each vendor. Because at the end of the day, what you care about is that end customer experience as opposed to, the actual operation of the network. So if you're looking at, how this is impacting and how this is, growing, areas like Southeast Asia are going, full blown with SON, right? Because they have higher densities of population and they need to be much more aggressive with how they manage their spectrum, how they optimize their networks, how they operate this, optimized networks.
Can I ask a question of you? Yeah. How much of it do your customers automate and allow the system to free run and do its thing versus taking recommendations and manually implementing? I'm very curious because I run into a lot of conservative people who are like going, well, tell me, but I'll do it myself because I'm afraid of the ramifications if the system runs wild.
So we're actually seeing a very interesting 50-50 split, right? 50% of our customers that have, spoken to us about what role we can play in SON have come to us and say, hey, you have this information from multiple domains. You can help us make better decisions. Can you run this analysis and just optimize the network for me, right? Because their main concern, it's cost, right? They want to streamline their operations moving forwards. Then we find customers that are mostly driven by quality of experience, and they go, look, I trust your data is fine, and it's, it's been collected right, and you've done the right analysis, but I trust my, my network planning guys a lot more than I will trust the machine, right? And I don't want a bad decision to actually drive bad customer experience because it's going to get magnified by the press and people are going to find out we're automating this and it's going to be a disaster. So it really depends on where you sit, right? If you're looking for that cost optimization, most people are going, yep, automate it will. If you're looking for that quality of experience improvement, people are going, no, let me be a part of that chain, of that decision-making chain. Just give me the right information.
Yeah. Does that reflect your experience?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I was listening with interest to what he said. Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Let me comment also.
Yes.
Actually, you give a nice 50-50%, but when we started, that percent was very low on the automated side. So that's why the standards, are being forecasted like, okay, put a SOM function there, but also give an option to interact, so open loop. Supervised mode option, right? That's a headache for the developers, right? Because in case of distributed, it should autonomously, it shouldn't be disturbed, for instance. But in the field, we see operators which are, we have operators deployed our solution closed loop mode. Every day it changes these parameters in relation with the rollouts that's happening, so it's an automated already. But in some other cases, they would like to see first get used to the recommendations, and then at the second stage, they want to move towards the closed loop side, which also you need to tackle with the IT concerns, right? So it's also another thing to tackle. But one thing we experienced for the last, few years, we see quite nice interest from operators in terms of SOM-powered managed services and the side of optimization. So and we have actually big projects over the last 2 years received. So it's also like a transition factor. So when you provide it, saying, hey, look, we have some solution, but we are going to improve, and then later on you can continue the service or use the some solution yourself. So that's like a nice business case also that's well accepted by the operators.
Okay.
I was just going to add something, because SON to me is a paradigm, if I could say that. It is because of the many angles that that it takes when it comes to an operator's enterprise, and typically, top management wants to improve management costs or management shorten time to manage the network dramatically. I mean, we're talking about wanting reductions to 90% in various aspects, and at the same time, they want data integrity. They want to make sure that everything is maintained. Kind of, there's a link to the old ways of working, right? So breaking that link, I thought it was going to happen quite fast, and I was a little naive. This was a couple of years ago, and it didn't happen that fast. And to his point as well, and I don't know if it's a combination of trust, right, from the operator, and also another aspect of it, we move into connecting parts, right? OSS, or the element manager, looks at various features. Here we're looking at connecting different components. So all of a sudden, each competency of the operator's personnel has to expand and has to work differently. So that takes time as well.
Yeah, I'd like to add something here. It's that no SON is an island. And what we've seen with some of our customers in Asia Pacific specifically, and they were very heavily in favor of automation, is that they were doing great when it came to automating radio performance, and then they hit the backhaul. And they went like, oh, but we didn't really plan for this much to go through here, so how can we make the backhaul dynamic, at the same time that we're making our radio network dynamic? How does this impact our EPC? How does this impact other areas of the network, our core transmission network, and all this stuff, right? So you find a lot of people who are hesitant about going full-blown automation because, they've tried it. They've tried it in the lab, or they've done small deployments, and then suddenly found out that there's so many moving pieces from radio access all the way to the core that get impacted that they don't have control over, and they need to start setting up processes and bridges to different groups that normally they wouldn't deal with.
So rather than us talking to each other, questions from the audience. You have three good experts here that you can take some questions. Yes.
I think, just from I know there's a more aspect for some, but just from the self-optimization perspective, I think one of the challenges I can see is, the small cell deployment and joint optimization, because we're talking about probably 5, 10 major macro vendor, while we're talking about hundreds of small cell vendors, right? What if you have multiple small cell vendors, co-located, same area with your major macro, and the challenges I can see is they're using different transport. The delay profile could be different. As well as, it could be trusted transport, it could be untrusted, as well as their statistic reporting cycles could be different. One was 15 minutes, the other was 1 second. And also, they're taking actions may be out of control, your control, right? So whether or not this will be converged as what you expected, how does that impact your, for example, centralized control or distributed control decision, as well as other expectations in terms of performance?
Anybody want to take it?
I can only speak from the infrastructure management side of it, right? Rather than the control side. But you're always going to find this variety of vendors, each one of them taking a standard and pushing it to the limits, right? And their implementation, their view of how the standard can be optimized for a specific application is going to be completely different from vendor B. Yet somehow, throughout all these years, we've been doing this for, 4 years now, we always find a way to make them work, right? We always know how to mediate between all these different technologies, normalize the data so it looks like, mostly a service-oriented representation, and then feed it back to the controllers, right? And have that normalized, view of things, like, TM forms made like a bandit, right? Doing that for, OSS and BSS. It's kind of time that someone steps up and takes that responsibility to say, okay, there needs to be, even if your implementation is completely different, if your protocols are different, if you have magic special sauce for, how you do your Doppler optimizations, normalize this data so other people can use it, right? And make better control decisions.
Maybe in this aspect, rather than the implementation differences, as we see, two different architectures proposed in the morning before the session, what we have been promoting as an optimization provider, the solutions should somehow provide symptoms on the algorithms that they run, so that these symptoms can be utilized on the higher levels in a vendor-independent way. Either it is different small cells vendor or different macro vendor, so at least the algorithm should be producing the symptoms. Let's say it's MRO counters, for instance, or some different kind of metrics related for the use cases. So as long as this, unless these are visible, it's not very practical to talk about true coordination between these two domains, even in intra-domain. I'm not talking about just between small cells, between macro layer also. I mean, you don't see macro vendor 1 MRO talking with macro vendor 2 MRO. No, they can't, because it's already also using proprietary functions there. So that's actually why we are putting emphasis on the standardization directly in SA5. And to some point we are influencing, and together with the operators and also vendors, some vendors which are in the same view. So we believe this is one of the main factors which will help to solve this headache, because this is a headache for the operators.
And I can add from my point of view, on the Spider Cloud platform, there's a DSON infrastructure which sets up the whole interior of the structure, and the points of interest tend to be the hand-in, hand-out points to go between the two networks. 35 dB of glass between you and the macro network is kind of liberating, because you don't worry about it as much. You still have to worry about it because when you're all reusing the same frequency band, you have to be concerned, but sometimes it's more concerns around macro dominance, keeping the UEs on board on the small cell network in the building instead of handing out to the outside world. So it's we see a need for the ability for a CSON system to read and understand the worldview that the small cell system is seeing inside the building and adjust accordingly, or take directives to adjust to what a centralized SON system is going to ask us to do. So it's an evolutionary journey, I think, from the perspective of going through a lot of IoT with operators, and then crafting the roadmap around a lot of those needs, and with the macro partners and that kind of thing.